He is the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General for Migration Development since 2006. He was responsible for the creation of the Global Forum on Migration and Development. He's president of the International Catholic Migration Commission and a member of the Migration Advisory Board of the International Organization for Migration. And before that, we can't really do justice to his CV. He has been Attorney General, European Commissioner, responsibility for competition policy, and I think for education for a period, Chairman of AIB, Founding Director General of the World Trade Organization, Chairman of BP, Chairman of the Trilateral Commission, Chairman of the London School of Economics, Chairman of Goldman Sachs, and now he is devoting his time, I think, almost exclusively to this issue of migration and development.
We have a dreadful development, it seems to me, of a sort of nationalism which all of these institutions were created to stop. We have a type of nationalism reflected in parties right across Western Europe, countries which were the most important in developing these principles that I've referred to. For an example, France, who I think deserve particular credit, the sort of Jacques Maritain and others, Monet, Schuman, and so on, at the beginning of the European Union. These countries now have, as we know, with forthcoming elections in Germany and France in particular being worrying, they have taken a different course, or at least a substantial number have taken a different course. And the Brexit vote in England was motivated in significant measure by the issue of migration. And all of this is a reflection, in my view, of a sort of nationalism that I reject. We've had too much of a violent nationalism in our history. We now know, surely, that you cannot define people by their race. The foreign-born population as a matter of interest in various European countries today is the following. Ireland, 15.8%, UK, 13.4%, Germany, 14.5%, Sweden, 18.5%, Luxembourg, 45.9%, Switzerland, 26.6%. The Irish figure is quite large. Its impact, however, is to be borne in mind in the context of the fact that the largest number of migrants that we have in Ireland are English, not even British, they're English. And whether we would have quite the same relatively constructive engagement with the migration phenomenon were they to have come from another more visibly different part of the world, we can speculate about. But I think we can be reasonably proud of where we are today. In terms of the African population, in 1950, Europe had a population twice that of all of Africa. Today, Africa is 40% larger than Europe. In 2050, Africa will have a population 3 times that of Europe. We had 1 million asylum seekers in Europe last year. As you know, asylum seekers, refugees who are entitled to asylum, are quite different from migrants. Refugees are people, essentially, who are escaping from war or persecution. and under a 1951 convention that was created out of the terrible war that created all the other institutions that I referred to. That created an obligation born out of the suffering of Jews in particular to give sanctuary, a sanctuary incidentally denied to many Jews by many countries in the period leading up to 1939. In Europe, in particular, to refer to that for a moment, there has been, in my opinion, a quite appalling reaction in some countries to the issue of migration, whether it be refugees or economic migrants. The Czech Prime Minister last week said, "We will take no more Muslim refugees." The Slovak Prime Minister, within the last month, said, "We will only take Christian migrants." Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, and the Czech Republic have all refused to accept the idea of sharing of migrants. There's been a vote by qualified majority voting in the European Union, which carried the conclusion that we should share and accept an objective quota system based on GDP, unemployment, total population, and so on. We now know that on the 2nd of October, the Hungarians will have a referendum on this issue. So we're going to have a referendum on a toxic issue like migration to upset or turn over a law that was agreed within the European Union. Where do we stand on this? Apart from our massive interest, at least in my view, in the survival of the European Union itself, leaving aside any moral concern to those who are to be denied refugee status. How can we as a continent, aspiring to a belief such as those values in the preamble to the Treaty of Rome, how can we countenance the creating of razor wire fences right up through Europe? How can we countenance the employment in the last short period of a large number of people in Hungary? I have to come back to Hungary again, where Mr. Orbán referred to refugees as a poison. This is a challenge to the European Union. It's a challenge to the United Nations. It's a challenge to the values which we believe in. But it's very easy for those of us who are in multilateral organizations, and I've been careful to stay in, apart from a failed candidacy for the Dáil once upon a time, to stay away from the appalling quagmire that is national politics. It's easy to say these things to politicians. But I think this is a time for the expression of values. In 2005, Kofi Annan, whom I knew when I was with the WTO, contacted me and asked me to become, he actually asked me to become High Commissioner for Refugees. And I said I would. When? And he said in a fortnight. And I said, hang on for a second, I don't know how I ever got the job, but I'm chairman, I said, of BP, and it's the biggest company it was at the time in Europe. I can't walk out in 2 weeks. Oh, then that's the end of that, he said. So that was the end of that. Then he came back to me a final time and said, will I become special representative, which I've done to my great pleasure ever since. But at that time, at the UN level, there was a strict division between the national sovereignty types, led by the United States, and those who believed in multilateralism. And when I went to meet the US representative to the UN, I was more or less thrown out of his office because he said, this was Bush regime, migration is a matter of national competence and sovereignty. We can't have foreigners looking into a constitution which we think is perfectly adequate to protect the rights of individuals. And we just have a lot of people from other countries with much worse standards throwing insults at us. A certain element of truth in that argument. But the US at that time was very concerned about creating any multilateral response to this situation. Well, since then, and on the event of Obama becoming president with a permanent representative born in this town, things have changed. And the US, in many ways, is presenting a leadership role in some of the things that we're doing. And what are we doing in the UN? Well, UNHCR is providing an enormous amount of support in camps all over the world. I went recently to Sicily, and I would say in the camp that I was there in for quite some time, that virtually everybody in the camp was not a refugee. So the issue is, what do we do for those who are not refugees? Do we have any responsibility for survival migrants who are leaving a natural disaster? Why should they be treated differently to people who are escaping from a war like Syria? I think we have an absolute obligation to support the relocation of migrants from Italy and Greece, and to share amongst Europeans with the spirit of solidarity which we have experienced, for an example, through the Regional and Social Fund over years in this country, share the responsibility. Now, we're not the worst. There are others who are far more difficult. But it is a responsibility which we cannot avoid. I think many of us are very happy with the migrants that we see and interact with in Ireland. But we do have to do a little more than just landing them in a house, in a remote spot. We have to surely integrate them into the Ireland of today. The institutions are vital, just as they are in the European Union. They can't be dismissed with an imperious wand as irrelevant. The Commission, for an example, was the one that proposed the quota sharing idea. But in order to defeat those who stand for a world which hopefully we all here reject, we need the articulation of a European position in particular that we as Irish people can be proud of.